This is Amber McLaughlin. Though on official record she was still listed as Scott. Amber was the first transgender woman ever executed in the United States. What she did was extraordinarily cruel. She stalked her ex-partner relentlessly until she delivered the ultimate punishment. With a kitchen knife, she unleashed a nightmare the state of Missouri has yet to forget. But she left a trail, one that led straight to the muddy banks of the Mississippi River. Tonight, we'll walk through that trail, the crime in detail, her years on death row, her final words and her last meal. Her death set a precedent, but what led her there was far more complex than a simple conviction. To some, it was the rightful end to a dark story. To others, it was a punishment too harsh, handed down to someone who had tried to change. Was it justice, or an execution that hides something deeper? Welcome to Final Sentence, the leading channel for death row stories and true crime.
November 20th, 2003. Earth City, St. Louis County, Missouri. Outside, dusk was settling in slowly. The sky still glowed with soft orange streaks, reflecting off the flat rooftops of a quiet industrial park. Office buildings were shutting down for the day. The last few employees were packing up, closing folders, grabbing coats. Car doors opened, engines started. Soft conversations filled the air. Everything felt routine. Everything seemed normal. Inside one of those buildings, a woman was getting ready to go home. She had her purse over her shoulder, her keys in hand. She walked calmly down the stairs, just another night, or so it seemed. Across the parking lot, a figure stood still, watching. Not moving, not speaking. No rush, no confusion, just waiting. There was no knock, no calling her name. The figure simply approached. And from that moment on, that place became the threshold of a nightmare, one that would end hours later by the edge of a river stained with blood. But before we show you what happened in that parking lot, let's take 30 seconds to look at who this person really was. Amber McLaughlin was born on January 13, 1973, in the state of Missouri. Though her gender transition began many years later, for most of her life she was known as Scott McLaughlin. Her childhood held no warmth and no safety. From a very young age, she was subjected to repeated abuse in foster care. It's also been documented that she was exposed to alcohol in the womb, which led to persistent cognitive difficulties and a lifelong struggle with mental health. During adolescence, suicide attempts began to quietly weave themselves into a routine. No one seemed to truly hear him. No one seemed to really see him. He was a withdrawn figure, quiet, with a kind of shyness that bordered on painful. Some people who later spent time with Amber in prison would go on to say she was one of the loneliest individuals they had ever met. As an adult, she tried to form connections. She entered a relationship with a woman named Beverly. At first, it seemed relatively stable, but soon it became filled with tension, fear, and obsession. After the breakup, Amber didn't accept silence as an answer. She called her. She looked for her. She showed up at her workplace. At some point, a restraining order attempted to establish distance. But distance isn't always enough when someone feels abandoned by everyone. At that point in her life, Amber was living with a diagnosis of severe depression, gender dysphoria, and an IQ estimated at around 82. Her gender transition had already begun internally, but hadn't yet been expressed publicly. Still, the fracture was visible. Part of her was trying to break through, while another part clung to what was familiar, even if it was destroying her from within. Those who watched from the outside could tell something was off, even if they couldn't say what it was. There was something in her eyes, in her presence, like she was there, but not entirely. A mix of quiet sadness and latent tension, as if she were always standing right on the edge of something, but never stepping over it. And then there was Beverly Guenther. She was 45 and living in Missouri. She had gone through difficult times, but at that stage of her life, she was focused on regaining control. She had found some stability, held a steady job, and had recently moved into a new home. A home that, for her, symbolized a new beginning. Those who knew her described her as a calm, private woman, focused on her work. She didn't usually share much about her personal life, but her colleagues knew she was trying to move on from a complicated relationship. For a while, she had been with Scott McLaughlin. At first, it had seemed like a stable, even caring relationship, but over time it became strained. Beverly began to feel watched, intruded upon, threatened. After the breakup, she kept her distance and tried to move forward. She wanted peace and, above all, safety. She even requested legal protection to prevent further contact, drawing a clear boundary. Still, she never stopped going to work. She kept her schedule, her space, her calm demeanor. She greeted people politely, did her job, and left at the same time every day. Her life wasn't perfect, but she was working on building something stable, something of her own. On November 20th, 2003, Scott McLaughlin headed to the parking lot outside the office where his ex-partner, Beverly Guenther, worked. He had already been there many times. He had watched her. He had stalked her. He had even violated a restraining order and broken into the building in the weeks prior. That afternoon, he waited outside, silent and still. When Beverly walked out of the building and headed toward her car, Scott approached. He had waited for the exact moment when no one else was around. With a kitchen knife, a steak knife, he forced her into her vehicle, leaving her no choice. From there, he drove in silence for several miles, away from St. Louis, heading toward a wooded area near the Mississippi River. There were no houses, no lights, no traffic, just trees, weeds, and darkness. Once stopped in the woods, Scott held the knife tightly and began to force Beverly to engage in sexual acts. This wasn't a request. It was a threat. He intimidated her, dominated her, overpowered her. No one heard. No one interrupted. What happened in those woods was brutal. Not only was she assaulted, she was struck, she struggled, she screamed beneath the weight of her fear. And then the knife began to stab. Again and again. The wounds were not random. They were aimed at her chest, her abdomen, and her neck. The attack was prolonged, violent, and most of all, personal. The blade broke during the act, a sign of extreme force, far beyond what would be needed to end a life. This wasn't a moment of impulse, it was a calculated decision, fueled by resentment and hate. When her body stopped moving, Scott dragged it a few feet and left it right there, in the forest. He didn't dig a hole. He didn't try to burn it. He didn't even bother to cover it with branches. He just left it among the weeds, as if he didn't care whether he'd be found or condemned. After the murder, he got back in the car and drove away. That same night, Beverly's co-workers noticed her car was still in the parking lot. They tried calling her, but there was no answer. She hadn't mentioned any plans. She had simply vanished. Police were notified. When officers arrived, the first thing they found was the vehicle, locked, the keys on the ground, and something that raised every alarm, the broken handle of a knife lying next to the car. There were small splatters of blood on the pavement and a pattern that forensics would later identify as a clear evidence of a struggle. Beverly hadn't left willingly. She had fought, she had resisted, and whoever had confronted her had come prepared, with a weapon. The scene was sealed. Investigators collected samples, photographed every mark, and logged all key evidence. Then a name came into focus: Scott A. McLaughlin, former partner, history of stalking, prior complaints, an active restraining order. That same night, after the crime, Scott tried to clean his car with bleach. He was acting strange, anxious. He asked a friend to drive him to a hospital in St. Charles, Missouri, said he needed medication, that he wasn't feeling well. Police were already looking for him, and as soon as he walked into the hospital, they identified him. He didn't resist. He didn't try to escape. He was quietly arrested. Hours later, during questioning, Scott didn't offer excuses or put up a fight. He simply said one sentence: "I left her by the river." Police escorted him to a wooded area near the Mississippi River. He walked without hesitation. He pointed directly to the spot. There, among the brush, lay the body of Beverly Guenther. She had suffered multiple stab wounds. Her clothes were still on, but forensic analysis would later confirm signs of sexual assault. The evidence collected in the woods matched what had been found in the parking lot. The knife was incomplete. The blade had been used until it snapped. The blood on the pavement marked the beginning, but not the end. Scott was transferred to a detention facility. He didn't scream. He didn't protest. He said nothing else. The police had what they needed, and the rest would be decided by a jury. The trial took place in 2006, 3 years after the crime. It wasn't a complicated case in terms of evidence. There was an indirect confession, a clear forensic scene, a logical chain of events that fit together seamlessly. No one disputed who had done it. What was at stake was the punishment. The prosecution laid out the full timeline of events, showing photos from the parking lot, the broken knife next to the car, the trail of blood, the signs of struggle, the history of stalking, and the active restraining order. Then came the walk to the woods, the sexual assault, the stabbing, the coldness with which Scott had led officers to Beverly's body. They asked for the maximum sentence, not out of revenge, but because the crime, in their view, was brutal, premeditated, and merciless. Because Beverly had spent her final moments under threat, humiliation, and pain, and because the killer had shown no real remorse at any point. The defense took a different approach. They presented reports about Scott's childhood. They spoke of years of physical and sexual abuse, of parental neglect, of suicide attempts beginning in adolescence, of a neurological dysfunction tied to fetal alcohol syndrome, of severe depression, and of borderline intellectual functioning with an IQ of just 82. They didn't deny Scott was guilty, but they argued he didn't deserve to die for it, that his life was also a tragedy, one marked by damage long before the crime, that the murder was horrific, yes, but what had come before couldn't be ignored. The jury was divided. Some felt that the death penalty was too harsh, others believed it was necessary. They couldn't reach a unanimous decision on the sentence. In most states, that would have meant an automatic life sentence, but not in Missouri. There, when a jury deadlocks, the final decision is left to the judge, and the judge made that decision. The judge imposed the death sentence. There were no cheers, no outbursts, just silence. Scott McLaughlin was officially sentenced to die by lethal injection. Years later, in 2016, a federal court overturned the sentence, arguing that the defense had failed to properly present Scott's traumatic life history during the original trial. But that hope didn't last. In 2021, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals reinstated the death sentence. This time, there would be no turning back. After the sentencing, Scott A. McLaughlin was transferred to the state prison in Bonne Terre, Missouri. That's where life on death row began. The isolation was total, the routine mechanical. Time passed within gray walls, double bars, and institutional silence. At first, Scott didn't attract much attention. He kept to himself, spoke little. He was quiet, almost invisible. But inside that cell, something began to shift. As the years went by, Scott began to express what he had kept hidden for most of his life. Through private conversations with other trans women in prison, he started to talk about his gender identity. It wasn't a sudden revelation. As he would later say, since the age of 12, he had felt that something inside didn't fit. He used to dress in secret. He felt different, but he never had the environment or courage to speak it aloud. It was in prison that he finally began living as Amber. She chose that name herself. She changed the way she spoke, the way she moved, the way she carried herself. She started writing letters, using female pronouns, referring to herself in the feminine, even with prison guards. She didn't receive formal hormone therapy, but she found validation in the presence of other trans women on death row. Those who knew her in those years described her as painfully shy. She wasn't violent, she didn't create trouble. She had a way of being present without ever demanding space. Over time, she became more open. She would make silly jokes, what some inmates called dad jokes, and she began sharing conversations with others. But not everything was light. Amber spent many hours alone. At night, she would write. In letters that later leaked to the press, she described herself as someone who had done terrible things, but had also suffered things no one should ever endure. During those years, her legal team filed multiple appeals. In 2016, they managed to have the death sentence overturned. The court found that her original defense had failed critically by not presenting evidence of her trauma and abuse. But the victory was short-lived. In 2021, another court reversed the ruling. The execution was back on the table. In December 2022, her final legal appeal was denied. The governor of Missouri rejected her clemency request. The reasoning was simple. The crime had been too violent. Amber knew her time was running out, and she faced it with an unsettling calm. She didn't panic. She didn't seek sympathy. She didn't launch a public campaign. In her final weeks, all she asked was to be remembered for who she had become, not for who she once was. Tuesday, January 3rd, 2023. At 6:51 p.m., Amber McLaughlin was pronounced dead at the state prison in Bonne Terre, Missouri. She was the first person executed in the United States that year, and the first transgender woman to be executed in the history of the country. The method was lethal injection. The procedure took place in a small, windowless white room, with a metal gurney at its center. Amber didn't request a special last meal. There were no unusual demands. In the hours leading up to her execution, she remained silent. She accepted her fate without resistance or ceremony. There were no major protests outside the prison, no chants, no candlelight vigils, just a small group of LGBTQ rights activists who quietly left flowers near the gate. Some held signs that read, "Not in my name." Others simply stood, looking down at the ground. In her final written statement, Amber said, "I am sorry for what I did. I am a loving and caring person." No one from Beverly Guenther's family was present, and if they were, they made no public statements. The state carried out the execution under standard procedure. No tributes, no spectacle. Just another entry in the system's record of executions. Amber McLaughlin died at the age of 49. The name listed on her death certificate was the same as the one in the original sentencing, Scott A. McLaughlin. Amber was executed for one of the most violent crimes ever recorded in the state of Missouri. Her case entered the history books for an unexpected reason. She became the first transgender woman ever executed in the United States. But that fact doesn't erase the essential truth. Beverly Guenther died at the hands of someone who stalked her, hunted her, and ultimately took her life in the most brutal way imaginable. During the trial, people spoke of trauma, of abuse, of abandonment, of a life shaped by pain from the beginning. But the question isn't whether that justifies the crime. The question is whether it explains it, and whether, in a system that claims to be just, there's still room to see people beyond what they've done, without ever forgetting those who are gone. Amber died alone, with a sentence written on paper. But those words are not enough to close a story like this. Do you believe this execution was an act of justice, or just the final chapter in a chain of violence that never stopped? Leave a comment if you found this story thought-provoking or necessary. Like the video to support the channel, and check out more cases by clicking the screen. Thanks for staying with me until the end. This was Final Sentence.